we heard, even in the introit, which was wonderful, most of the time when we think about Lent, we think about being on a journey or a pilgrimage, because we're thinking about, as Wayne is talking about in his adult Bible study class, and if you're not going, hope you'll start, because he has some great stuff. But it's about this 40 days of kind of thinking about our journey getting closer to God. But I want to think during Lent about this Lent being a time of reading our own story and writing some of our story, and just seeing how much God is writing our story, and recognizing how God is permeating all parts of our story, whether we're having a happy ending story at the time, or it's a mystery story or a horror story, that always we can look back even and see that in those stories God was present in that story. Now last week I didn't preach, as most of you know, because I was sick all week. I couldn't prepare it. Now I know some people think all I do is get up and talk and I don't do any prep. But trust me, that's not true. And I just could not get it ready last week, so I finally gave up, and I so thank Wayne and Peggy for doing a fabulous job. But I wanted last week to look and see that in our story, and where it's like Jesus' story there in Luke 4, because we too are tempted, just as Jesus was. Now, we don't get the same temptations as Jesus. I mean, I'm not really thinking I can turn a stone into bread, okay? But my temptations fit me. And they just smoothly fit into my story. And so I want to recognize them as temptations just as Jesus did. In this one today, I don't see us so much as Jesus in this story, as I'm thinking we're fluffy little chicks. You know how we see all those little chicks, these brand new baby chicks during Easter? You know, those sweet little fluffy things? That's you and me in the story today. That's how I see it anyway. I know it's not real flattering, okay? But obviously, in the middle of the story, the center of this story is Jesus. And one of the things that is so clear about Jesus as we go through any of the Gospels, but it's very obvious here, is that Jesus' story, as far as Jesus is concerned, is not a mystery story. He already knows the end. He's already read the end of the book. And so when the Pharisees come and say, you better get out of here, because Herod wants to kill you, Jesus is going, hey, I've read the end of the story, and Herod doesn't kill me. This is no big deal. So I'm going to just keep doing what I'm doing. Why Herod doesn't like the fact that he's going around casting out demons and healing people, I'm not sure. But Jesus says, I know the end of my story. And Herod is just a fox. And in the Old Testament, a fox is not so much sly and wily like we think of them, and we have them in our little myths and stuff. He's a nuisance. He's kind of like a rodent. He's just kind of gets in the way, and he's destructive. But he doesn't have a lot of power. And Jesus is saying, hey, you know, he really is not much in my story. And I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to do the first and the second day, and the third day I finish. I mean, he knows that his story is set, and he is committed to obeying Jesus and going through in his story. Or obeying God and going through his story. But also, Jesus recognizes that this Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem, that it's about him too. Because really in the end, Jesus replaced the temple. He is the temple now. And he's saying, you know, Jerusalem, I've got to die, I'm going to die there. That's how it's supposed to work. That's how the story is written. Now, you and I don't know our stories quite We don't know the pieces of the story like Jesus knew the pieces of the story for himself. And it'd probably be a little harder for us if we knew that we needed to go straight to Jerusalem so we'd get hung on a cross. I mean, a little harder for most of us, I'm thinking, to say, leave me alone, I'm on my way. But Jesus knows this is important because there is such a huge message to the Jewish people, but also to the whole world that's going to happen there. So it can't happen in some little place that no one's ever heard of that's now underground in Galilee. That's not going to make headlines. No, it's got to happen in Jerusalem. And besides, that's where prophets get killed. So Jesus is looking and saying, I get this. I know my story. It's not a mystery. It's mapped out. And I know when I go to Jerusalem, they're going to want to kill me like they've done the prophets. And yet, what does he say? Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often have I yearned to gather you up in my arms the way a hen gathers her chicks. This is a very strange but compassionate view of Jerusalem, that Jesus loves them so much that he wants them to run and hide under his wings. Now, some of you may have heard stories of birds who have stayed put during a forest fire, or stayed put when a predator comes, and finally someone comes along and picks up this dead mama bird and picks her up, and underneath are live chicks. It's happened often. That is an amazing ability or instinct or whatever God's given a mother bird, that she won't run for her life. But she stays there and dies to save her chicks. And Jesus is saying that very same thing about himself. That he is the mother hen who wants to have us all gathered under his wings, so when a predator comes, he gives his breast to the fox. That nice, juicy breast. And gives us time to run off. Or he's the one that will stay there. He's going to take the worst of whatever the danger is. But the problem for Jerusalem, and the problem, I think, for you and me, is that we aren't bird-brained. And if we were bird-brained enough, we would have the sense enough to run and hide under his wings. But too often, when danger of whatever kind comes running towards us, or we see it on the horizon, we run around like chickens with their heads cut off. We run around like crazy. And we try everything we can to get it under control. Instead of first running under his wings, running and getting to the place where from there we can see what needs to be done and he can direct us, but we don't run around and scatter all over the place. And yet that is what Jerusalem did, and that's what we often do, especially in those times when maybe we've lost someone we loved, or we lost a job, we've lost a relationship, or even sometimes when we've made our own mistakes, our own sin that's gotten us in a bind, we have a tendency to want to take control. Sometimes people criticize us and misunderstand us, and we want to take control. This is a danger. This is a threat to us. And so we are going to get out there and run around like crazy and make this right. But Jesus says, no, I want you to come, get under my wings, find your safety here. And it doesn't mean we won't do anything, but we do it from that place, with him, care of us, with him surrounding us. And I was thinking that probably one of the biggest dangers to most of us, even though we know that death has been conquered by Christ on the cross, and we don't see that completed until the new heaven and the new earth. And so the biggest danger for most of us is death. And most of the time what I've seen is, it's not our own death. It's the death of someone else that we love, or others that we love. And some people, when this happens, they do run and hide in Jesus' embrace. And from there, they can yell and be angry. From within his embrace, they can ask him questions they can't get answers to. And they can be sad and angry and all those things that happen when we're grieving. But others find this happen and they can reject Jesus because he shouldn't have let that happen. And so instead of finding peace in his embrace, they live with anger. Instead of finding healing, their scar is always hurting. Just because we are, and we're like that a lot. We like to think we're a lion or a bear, and we're really just these teeny little chicks with this little fur, these teeny little legs. We're really not that big of stuff. But we try. And we cheat ourselves and those around us because we don't find what Jesus wants to give us in his embrace. But I do think that if we believed that he really wants to take us and embrace us, even when we are angry and scattered, even when we reject him, he's still out there yearning for us. And when we believe that about him, I think that when danger pops up in our story, because it does, that just is part of what it is to live now, before the whole thing is recreated. And that means that, but when that happens, and the more we recognize his yearning for us and believing in that, those things aren't going to throw us off, and they're not going to scatter us. But we can be at peace and have a sense of confidence, even though we don't know all the answers. And I thought of this in, like a little boy that I read about who went on a walk one afternoon with his grandfather. And it turned out to be a very long walk. And while they were still at the creek, and the little boy was throwing his stones into the creek and playing in there and everything, having a great time, his grandfather noticed it was starting to turn to dusk. It was getting a little late in the day. And he thought, I've got an idea. I'm going to teach this boy a lesson. So he said to the little boy as he was playing, he said, oh, do you know where the road is? And the little boy said, no. And he just kept on playing. So a little while later, the dad said, or the grandpa said, well, do you know where the house is? No. And, finally, the grandpa said, well, it's getting pretty late. Can you show me how to go home? At least which direction to go. And the little boy finally thought, this is kind of a strange thing. So he stops and he looks at his grandpa and he says, no. And the grandpa said, well then, you know what, son? You're lost. The little boy looked at him and he said, no, I'm not. I'm with you. And that's what I want us to have that with us in our hearts when we run into that danger and the trials and the lostnesses that come into our story, because it happens. That we can say, okay, I have no idea how this is going to turn out. I have no idea what's going to happen. I have no idea what to do. But I know this. I'm with Jesus. I got a hold of him, and even better, he's got a hold of me. And so this is going to work. So I don't need to scatter. I'm just going to to let him gather me up and go from there, knowing that some way, somehow, Jesus is going to make that part of the story much better than we ever thought possible. Amen.